here in Mark 13. We're picking up, I'm kind of overlapping a little bit because last week I didn't spend a whole lot of time explaining verses 14 through 23, especially one thing in particular. I'm going to spend more time on that tonight. You're also going to want to put your thumb in Daniel chapter 9. If you don't have a Bible, you're going to want one. Because again, I don't want you guys to hear what I say and consider what I say because I'm the guy on the stage saying it. I want you guys to know, what does he actually have to say? Because I make mistakes teaching. I know you're like, well, of course I know that. A lot of people say, we know that. But a lot of people will just listen to someone without actually testing it. I want you to test these things as you hear them tonight. So, hope for the future. Mark 13, starting at verse 14. Let's just start at verse 14. Read with me. Jesus continues to tell his 4 disciples of things to come. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand. Then those who are in Judea must flee to the mountains. The one who's on the housetop must not go down or go in to get anything out of his house. And the one who's in the field must not turn back to get his coat. But woe to those who are pregnant and to those who are nursing babies in those days. But pray that it may not happen in the winter. For those days will be a tribulation such as has not occurred since the beginning of the creation which God created until now, and never will be. Never will. Unless the Lord had shortened those days, no life would have been saved. But for the sake of the elect, whom he chose, he shortened the days. And then if anyone says to you, behold, here is the Christ, or behold, there, do not believe. For false Christs and false prophets will arise, and will show signs and wonders, in order to lead astray, if possible, the elect. But take heed, behold, I have told you everything in advance. So, guys, last week we started what's called the Olivet Discourse. Jesus has left the temple, which is in Jerusalem. He's crossed down, he went down the Kidron Valley and up to the other side, and he's on the Mount of Olives, which is why we call it the Olivet Discourse. Okay, he's disclosing, he's having dialogue, and he's describing things from the Mount of Olives about what's to come in the future. Both near future to his time and distant future even to our time today. Jesus is describing end times in prophetic sequence. There is a sequence to these things. Now keep in mind 3 things, just like I said last week. Keep in mind 3 things as we plod through this prophecy. Number 1, the people. Who is Jesus speaking to? This isn't rhetorical. Who's Jesus speaking to in this Olivet Discourse? Anyone remember?
The Jews.
Okay, yeah, Israel, the Jewish people. His 4 disciples represent, right? Jesus, don't forget, is of Jewish descent, okay? He came into the line of Israel, okay? And he's speaking to his 4 disciples who are Jewish. The people. Jesus answers a Jewish question with a Jewish focus. What was the question? Well, remember in the beginning of chapter 13, his guys point out, look at these marvelous buildings and stones, Jesus. And they were walking out of what's called Herod's temple. It took in total 86 years to do a remodel and vamp of incredible dimensions on the Temple Mount. It was one of the ancient wonders of the world. You could see the temple for miles and miles away, and they said it looked like it was covered in snow because it was glistening white. I mean, imagine in the middle of summer, you look, and miles away, you see this massive structure on top of this mountain, and it looks like it's covered in snow. It was a marvel. People all over the ancient world would come just to see the Jewish temple that Herod had revamped. So they say, look, Jesus, and he says, in verse 2, do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left upon another, which will not be torn down. I talked about it last week. The stones, the magnitude of this building, for Jesus to say, yeah, it took 46 years to do this, it's going to be ripped down. They're like, what? How? Jesus answers a Jewish question with a Jewish focus. Number 2, so we looked at the people. Number 2, the purpose. Jesus tells Peter, Andrew, James, and John the mind-blowing truth, not to make them afraid, not to freak them out, not to be sensational, like, hey, guess what I know about the future? No, Jesus told them these things to build them up, actually to encourage them, and ironically enough, comfort them in his word. See, 1 Corinthians 14:3 tells us that prophecy is to edify. That means build up, to exhort, to encourage, and to comfort. That's what prophecy is to those who believe in Jesus. Now, to those who aren't believers and followers of Jesus, when we read this stuff, it's pretty dark. It can be frightening. People have made movies on this. There are people, I remember back in 2012, I said this last week, I had a friend asking me about the Mayan calendar. People who don't know Jesus, and especially people who don't know what Jesus has to say, there are people in the church who are freaked out about the end of the world because they don't know what Jesus has to say, what God's word has to say about the future. Get to know it because it's meant to actually build you up and encourage you and comfort you in your faith in Jesus. And the third is the point. What's the point? All of this points to who Jesus is. We don't read this to sensationalize over end times, okay? Jesus doesn't give his 4 disciples material for the next blockbuster apocalyptic movie, right? That's not the point. The point actually is to point them to him. He is the revelation, guys, of truth. When Jesus said in John 14:6, I'm the way, the truth, the life, it all points to him. So as we continue to go through this, ask yourself, what does this say to me about Jesus? How does this reveal who Jesus is to me? I'll just say this right now as it comes to mind. There's so much attention and ooh and awe and sensationalism over the Antichrist. But we read in Scripture, God's not impressed with the Antichrist. Not because, well, yeah, it's because he's his enemy. No, he's nothing special. We don't read about end times to know the Antichrist. We read about the end times to know the Christ, the one, the Savior. He's the hero. So, and we know that the spirit of prophecy is the witness of Jesus. I'm going to say that again. The spirit of prophecy is the witness or testimony of Jesus, Revelation 19:10 tells us. It's all about Jesus. So keep that in mind as we go through this. So, first question I want to ask, looking at those verses I read, 14 through 20. What's the abomination of desolation? We don't talk like that, right? Abominable snowman, I guess. I don't know. We don't use words like abomination or desolation. So what's Jesus talking about when he says this? First of all, remember, and I know I keep saying this, but it's so critical to understand. If you want to understand Mark 13, there's some things you got to go in, your view, your filter has to see. Jesus' answer is to Jewish disciples about Jewish life revolving around Jewish worship, okay? The temple was central to Jewish identity, which is why they go, what? When they say, tell us, what is it here? Tell us in verse 4, when will these things be and what the sign when all these things are going to be fulfilled? Guys, in common day language, they're going, when is the end going to happen? Because they can't conceive a future for Israel or really for the world if the temple's gone. They're asking him, when's the end coming? So he answers that based on who he's talking to. He's not talking to Americans. He's not talking to Christians who knows what happens at the end of Mark chapter 16. Remember, Jesus hasn't even gone to the cross yet. So the things, imagine putting yourself in their shoes. And he's telling them these things, and he hasn't even died on the cross. They don't even conceive and understand what he's about to do. And he's just days out from dying on the cross. So this is rocking their world big time. Again, Mark 13 is not about the church. Now, there are instances, hints, glimpses to the church, but the church is not the focus here. When he told them the temple would be destroyed, they thought it meant the end of life as they knew it. They could not see a Jewish future without the temple. And so I want to remind you of a question I asked last week. What or who in your life is impossible to imagine living life without? A lot of Christians in the church, when looking at end times, go, where's America in the Bible? We're not that big a deal as we think we are. So what happens if the country you live in crumbles and goes away. I mean, there's all kinds of scenarios, right? We've even had movies about that, like Red Dawn, the old version and the new version. What if the Russians take over? Didn't the Russians take over in both Red Dawn movies?
It was North Korea.
Yeah, but they were with Russia, right?
I don't know.
Yeah.
But yeah, North Korea was definitely the
Russia was
focus of the
with-
new one. Yeah.
Russia was with
Yeah.
North Korea.
What would happen if North Korea took over? Or what would happen if, let's say, a country like Iran sent some guys over here and blew off EMP bombs and just totally wiped out our power grid? What would we be without our technology?
No.
Rhetorical question. All this to say, I want you to think about, what do you put hope and security in right now? For Peter, Andrew, James, and John, this was the temple. They thought, like every Jew in their day thought, as long as the temple's standing, we're okay. We can take what comes. So that when Jesus says it'll be gone, their minds literally were blown. They couldn't conceive this. To be completely desolated was tantamount to the end of the world. But what did Jesus say in John 2:19? Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. The Jews then said, it took 46 years to build this temple, and you'll raise it up in 3 days? And the temple complex wasn't even done with construction. He says, but, verse 21, he was speaking of the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he said this, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had spoken. Sometimes we read prophecy and we're trying to call the shots before it happens. There's a number of things, guys, that we're going to hear now, just like Jesus told his guys. We're not going to fully understand it until it comes to pass. So why does he tell us? So when it comes to pass, you can go, Jesus knows. He really is the anchor for my heart. So no matter what happens in life, you guys probably have heard the saying. It's cliche, but it's true. I can't tell you what my future holds, but I know who holds it. Do you have that confidence to know that no matter what happens in life, you're going to be good? You're not just going to be okay. You're going to be good. No matter what happens. Imagine the Christians in Ukraine right now, and they're saying, no matter what happens, I'm good. Do we have that perspective? In Revelation 21:3, we read that Jesus, not a building, Jesus is the temple of God, the tabernacle of God. The dwelling of God is Jesus, not a building. Which again, if this building went away, when COVID 2020 happened, all that, and the doors were shut, you can have your opinions on, what you thought about that. Should churches do it or not? It doesn't matter. It's a moot point. What happens if this building isn't available? Rhetorical question. Does the church go away when the building goes away? That's a distinction. The church is not a thing, it's a who. Jesus is the temple of God. Here's your first point. Jesus is your fortress, foundation, and future. See, because Jesus doesn't change. He's the same yesterday, today, and forever. Hebrews 13:8. Question is, do you believe that? Do you actually believe he is unchanging? And do you actually find your hope and security in him? How you answer that will determine how you're able to live the rest of your life. But let's go back to the first question I asked. What is the abomination of desolation? Keep your thumb there in Mark 13 and turn over to Daniel chapter 9. Daniel 9. Daniel 9 verse 26. I'll give you a minute.
Will you though?
Yep. I'll give you a minute. Daniel 9, 26. Cue awkward jazz music in the elevator. Everybody online is like, what is he doing? I don't know. Snapping my fingers. Okay. That's been 40 seconds. Is everyone there yet? Not yet? Daniel 9, 26. Boom, doom, 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 doom. Not unusual. Okay. You know, it's really awkward for me when I wait because I have to I see me right there. Ugh. And when I get to teach, I can ignore this right here. All right, we there? Daniel 9:26. Just a side note, a little tidbit. If you have ever read or want to read the book of Revelation and you feel like, well, it's impossible to really know what it means. One, that's not true. Otherwise, God wouldn't have given it to us. And two, if you want to understand the book of Revelation, you need to study and understand the book of Daniel. Daniel is the key to unlocking the book of Revelation. Okay? So, Daniel 9:26. Daniel is receiving this prophecy. He's not saying this, okay? And angels come and said this to him. Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. You know what? Why don't we start at verse 24? Verse 24. Daniel is seeking God about the future, and he gets more than he bargains for, okay? He's seeking the immediate future of his people. And God says, I'm going to tell you things that you can't even comprehend right now. But people after your time will read what you wrote that I gave you, and that will make sense. In verse 24, Gabriel says, 70 weeks have been decreed for your people, that is Israel, and your holy city, that is Jerusalem, to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, that's a big statement, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Anyone, most holy place is?
Ourselves.
No.
Oh, tabernacle.
Well, in this context, I think I'm tracking with you. Yeah, your body is the temple of God. But in this context, the most holy place to Jewish people is the temple, okay? So, verse 25, you are to know and discern from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem. At this point in Daniel's life, Jerusalem was in ruins. Babylonians destroyed it and carted them off in exile, okay? And then the Persians came in, destroyed Babylon. So Daniel's under Persian rule at this point. He says, at the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah, the Prince, it's capitalized there, 7 weeks and 62 weeks, it will be built again, the plaza and moat, even in times of distress. So now we have context here. Verse 26, then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing. And the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. And its end with a flood. Even to the end there will be war. Desolations, that's plural, are determined. And he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. But in the middle of the week, he'll put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering. And on the wing of abominations, one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction. One that is decreed is poured out on the one who makes desolate. Now, if you're scratching your head and that's confusing, that's okay. I'm going to help you understand some of it tonight. But I just want you to know, I've read this myself over and over and over and studied it multiple times to understand this. So I'm not expecting you to get it all tonight. Why do I have us here? Because abominations, desolate, abomination of desolation is the expression Jesus uses. What does he mean when he says that? He's referring to Daniel's prophecy. And every Jewish reader, every Jewish person knows, every Bible reading Jew knows this is what Jesus is referring to. The death of Jesus, it says here in verse 26, the Messiah will be cut off after how many weeks? 62 weeks. The death of Jesus as a Messiah was foretold down to the day. If you do the math, and I won't do it tonight, from the issuing of the decree, Cyrus the Great issued the decree to rebuild Jerusalem. From that moment, the prophetic clock started. Now remember, the prophetic timeline that God gives revolves around what people group? Jewish people, Israel. That's important to understand, okay? But the moment Cyrus issued a decree to rebuild, Boom, the clock started. Literally on the day of the decree. And then after 62 weeks, you're like, weeks, huh? I'll get there in a second. The Messiah was cut off, literally killed. But then what happens next? We'll get back to weeks here in a second. What happens after the Messiah is cut off? The people of the prince, so not Messiah the prince, a different prince. The people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary. The people of the prince, after the Messiah dies, the people of the prince who's to come will destroy what? The city and the sanctuary. Real quick, what city are we talking about?
Jerusalem.
Okay, Jerusalem. And what sanctuary?
Temple.
Right, in Jerusalem, on the mount, right? Jesus promised in Matthew 23:37 that Jerusalem and her temple would be destroyed. Jesus died somewhere around 32, 33, okay, AD. Less than 40 years later, his promise was fulfilled to detail. He didn't just say it's going to be wiped out. He said how it's going to be wiped out, what will happen when it's wiped out. And his disciples, almost all of them, if not all of them, saw Jesus' promise come true. In 70 AD, a guy named General Titus of the Roman Empire, who later became the Caesar of Rome, came in, surrounded, barricaded Jerusalem. By the way, there had been a long-going revolt, and they allowed the Jewish people to flee to the inner city walls of the ancient city of David. And as they went in, they wouldn't let them back out until the Roman forces broke in through the walls, pushed them all the way to the Temple Mount, and they slaughtered them wholesale, man, woman, child. The Lord also told Daniel in verse 27 that the prince of the people would later come in the middle of the week. Look, when he says week here in Daniel 9, he's not talking a literal week. Okay, we're not talking 7 days. And I know that because the word week in Hebrew isn't actually week. It's just 7. It's a measurement. It's a unit of 7. In the same way I could use the word dozen, or a baker's dozen if you really like your donuts, okay? I could say a dozen, and you'd say a dozen what? Dozen what? Dozen means 12, but 12 what? The context here is years, okay? So when he says the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing after the 62 weeks, so from the moment it's decreed, 62 sevens, 62 sets of 7 years. Do the multiplication, okay? The Messiah will be cut off. That's down to the day, which this isn't even part of the teaching. That is just one of many examples how precise God's prophecy is. Jesus could not have randomly died on any given day. It had to be on a certain day. It had to be exactly on that day. And nobody could have orchestrated these events to go the way they did. All that to say, Jesus' death on the cross is profoundly, powerfully prophetic. It's not vague. It's not Notre Dame's vague generalities. It is specific. All that to say, week is a poor translation. Dozen is the same thing as saying 12. In Hebrew, it's not week, it's Shabuah, and it's a measure of 7. Daniel's talking years, which means 1 week is literally one set of years. One set of 7 years. Now, we're talking about abominations, desolation. Abomination of desolation. I'm not going to take you there, but in Daniel 8, there's a prophecy given. A prophecy that foretells a man who would be a prototype of the one that we call the Antichrist. People have asked, speculated, fascinated, made movies, talked about who this Antichrist will be, where he comes from, all of that. The Antichrist, we want to know what language will he speak, what country will he come from. God gives us something better than that. He gives us his personality, the way he functions and operates, what makes him tick. Daniel 8 is a prophecy where God tells Daniel about a man who will come future to his time, but he's not the Antichrist. He's a type of the one to come. 170 years before Jesus came, a man called Antiochus Epiphanes ruled Israel's land and people. You can look him up in your history books. This isn't, myth according to the Bible. God called it in advance, and then later on, history happens, and they're like, oh. So this guy, Antiochus, he killed his brother, and he killed both of his nephews to wipe out any other people getting in the way of him ascending the throne. He murdered his way to the top of the Seleucid kingdom. The Seleucid kingdom was one of the 4 Greek kingdoms that splintered as a result of Alexander's death. Okay? Seleucid kingdom was based predominantly in Turkey and Syria. What is Turkey and Syria today? So this guy murders his way to the top, and he cunningly curries favor with the Jewish people who he ruled over. And then, all of a sudden, pretty quickly, he turns on him. They think this guy's great. He turns on them. And he doesn't just turn on them, he stops their regular sacrifice. By the way, remember, the temple was the place where Jewish people worship God. This was the building where they met with God, okay? For us, this building goes down, whatever, big deal. For the temple to be destroyed, they're like, our whole way of life ceases to exist. He goes in and he stops the sacrifice, so they're not able to commune and have relation with God. And then he takes a pig, and if you don't know anything about Jewish law, pigs are unclean animals, unkosher. He goes in knowing this, sacrifices a pig in the Holy of Holies and splatters its juice all over the inside. I mean, that's gross to us, but it is anathema. It is blasphemous beyond comprehension to a Jewish mind. And then, add insult to injury, then he takes a statue of Jupiter, aka Zeus, and puts it up in the Holy of Holies. And then this is why we call him, this is why history remembers him as Antiochus Epiphanes. Literally, Epiphanes means the epitome, not epitome, the incarnate. He was declaring himself Zeus in the flesh. Abominable. It was an abomination. Antiochus defiled God's temple with abomination. The word abomination literally means detestable idolatry. What did God say in the 10 Commandments? You shall not worship anything created. Heavens, on the earth, under the earth, in the sea. You shouldn't worship and on top of that, don't make an image of anything to represent me. What does he do? He goes way beyond that. That's an abomination. The word desolation is destruction. So to sum it up here, Daniel foretold, really, God told Daniel, and then wrote it down, that after the Messiah would be killed, the prophetic clock would stop. The prophetic clock would stop, and the temple would be destroyed. Later, a man who is going to be descended from the people who destroyed the temple, real quick. Who were the people that destroyed the temple in 70 AD? Romans. And specifically, the 10th Roman Legion. Now, I'm not going to split hairs, but remember, the Roman Empire was huge, and they brought people from every background into their empire. And if you wanted to be recognized as a Roman citizen, which came with some pretty prestigious privileges, you could enlist into the army for 20 years, and if you make it out alive, you would get rights and privileges as a Roman citizen, which was a big deal.
Paul was born in that.
The 10th Roman Legion, by the way, they're not from Italy, but I won't get into that tonight. But all this to say, this prince of the one who's to come, this prince who is the fulfillment of the abomination of desolation, comes from the people who destroyed the temple. So we have context. Rome destroyed the temple in 70 AD. And it says here in verse 27, look at Daniel 9:27, he'll make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week. That's Bible language for he's going to confirm, or some say sign, a peace treaty with the world. And again, what people does all of this prophecy revolve around? Israel, yeah, the Jewish people. 2 things, then we're going to move on. The temples experienced abomination in its past and desolation, but never at the same time. We've seen guys like Antiochus. And matter of fact, even before Antiochus, Epiphanes, Israel's own people were doing that. They were bringing in idols, which is why God brought prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. Knock it off, cut it out, Quit worshiping other gods. Quit bringing other idols in here. Don't put idols in there with me. I am the God. That's it. So even before Antiochus, they were doing abominable things with idolatry. And then we know that Babylon desolated the first temple, and then Rome desolated the second one. But we've never seen abomination and desolation together at the same time. What we're reading about here in Daniel and what Jesus is saying in Mark 13 is about a time that we haven't yet seen. It's a convergence of events. So Jesus warns in Mark 13 that when the Jewish people see this, go ahead and go back to Mark 13. Mark 13, in verse 15 through 20, long story short, he says to his Jewish audience, when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, now we have an understanding of that, get out. Run for your life. Don't go back in your house. Don't leave the field. Leave the city. Leave completely. Don't turn around. Don't try and collect things. You don't have time. Pray it doesn't happen in winter, and it will be such a horrible, horrible time for those who are pregnant and nursing. It's going to be a time, Jesus says, that is unparalleled ever in human history. Since the beginning of time until then, and never again. It's going to be that horrific, guys. So Jesus says to his Jewish audience, take it as a sign to run away immediately. Now, 2 Thessalonians, Paul writes, now we request you, brethren, with regard to the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ and our gathering to him, that you not be quickly shaken from your composure, or be disturbed either by a spirit or a message or a letter as if from us. See, in the early church, there were people who were spreading lies, just like we see today. And there were some who were saying, you've missed it. The day of the Lord's come and you've missed it. And Paul says, no, that hasn't. That's not from us. And he says in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, let no one in any way deceive you. That's important. Don't be deceived. Why? Because Jesus said to them in Mark 13:5, see to it that no one misleads you. Do not be tricked. Don't be duped. Don't be deceived. For it will not come. The day of the Lord will not come unless the apostasy comes first. And here it is. The man of lawlessness is revealed. That's the Antichrist. The son of destruction. You could say desolation. Who opposes and exalts himself above every so-called God or object of worship, so that he takes his seat in the temple of God, displaying himself as being God. Now, I mentioned this last week. This is why it's so significant and kind of amazing that Israel's back in the land. The Jewish people have the land. They live in the land. And there is talk of rebuilding the third temple. The third temple doesn't exist right now. But I don't know if you knew this, but a certain group of very religious Jews have recreated all the furniture that's needed to furnish the temple. They just need the green light to start building the temple. And there's a couple obstacles, big obstacles that keep them from that. In order for the abomination of desolation to happen, there has to be a third temple, which is why you might have heard Christians get all fascinated with talk of the third temple. Why? Because it all points to the end. There's a lot of stuff happening in our world that's not making the news, because the news and the world doesn't think it's that important. But God, Jesus is saying, yes, it is. So here's a question. When does Jesus come back? Look at Mark 13, verse 24 with me. But in those days, after that tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. And the stars will be falling from heaven, and the powers that are in the heavens will be shaken. Then they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. And then he will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. Real quick question, this isn't rhetorical. We see the word or the term elect come up. Who is the elect in this passage?
God's people.
Well, God's people, but who? Christians are God's people. Who's the audience Jesus is speaking to? We're talking about Jews. Now, you're like, wait, does that mean we're not elect? No, I'm not saying that either. I'm not going to, for the sake of time, if you're really interested, write this down. Go read Romans chapter 9 through 11. Paul clearly distinguishes between the house of Israel and the church. Okay? Now, can you be, if you're a Jew, does that mean you're part of the church? Well, that depends. Do you believe that Jesus is the Messiah? Have you accepted him as your Savior and your Lord? If so, then yeah. Then you, verse 14 and through here, not going to apply to you because you're not going to be around to see it. So Jesus makes it clear that his return's not going to be subtle. He says in verse 26, they will see the Son of Man coming in clouds with great power and glory. Jesus on his second arrival is not coming as a baby in a manger. He's coming on the clouds, in the clouds with great power and glory. Unmistakable. When Jesus returns, the whole world, not just Israel, the whole world is going to see him. Matthew 24:27, Jesus says, like lightning. When you see lightning go off and it shines to the east, that's what my arrival is going to look like. I mean, except we're talking supernatural lightning from heaven. Not the universe, not the atmosphere. I mean God's domain. He's coming. Thor can't hold a candle to Jesus. Now we're talking about when does Jesus come back? We read this last week, but I want to say this seriously. Don't be deceived into thinking anyone else can save you. America can't save you. Our government can't save you. The UN can't save you. NATO cannot save you, as many European nations are seeing that right now. NATO can't hardly stand up against Russia, much less save you. Do not be deceived into thinking anyone or anything, any institution can save you, okay? Eating sustainable and organic, which my family by and large eats organic. Jim gives me a hard time about eating rabbit food. Jim's like, yes, I do. We go way back on that. I eat organic, but I don't eat organic because I think it's going to save the world. Living green, whether that's converting to electric from gas power, going vegan. You want to be vegan? There's no sin against being vegan. Why, though, are you doing it? What's motivating it? Not having children. And I'm not even going to get into political people. Many people for decades have said we need to stop making people. That's not going to change the course. That's not going to save the world. Taking away guns or controlling people's behavior will not save the world. Whether you're pro-Second Amendment or not, Jesus doesn't bring this up in Mark 13. Why? Because it's not about America. The world doesn't revolve around us as much as we feel like or unaware think so. Really, it doesn't. What's going to save this world? He said it. He is. He's going to come back. He's going to clean house. We want peace. We want peace and prosperity in this world. You need the Prince of Peace. You want prosperity? Then you need the God who owns the cattle on 1,000 hills, who owns all the gold and the silver on planet Earth, in planet Earth, not to mention all the resources of the universe that we like to speculate about. He owns it all. He made it all. Jesus and only Jesus is salvation. There is no other way. When Jesus returns, he'll gather his people Israel. Dead and alive, by the way. You notice that? It says here in verse 27, look at Mark 13:27. He says, then he, that is the Son of Man, will send forth the angels and will gather together his elect from the four winds, from the farthest end of the earth to the farthest end of heaven. And we know from Daniel 12, verse 1 through 3, that the Jewish people who believed in God, who obeyed and followed God pre-Jesus, pre-crucifixion, are going to be raised back to life. Why? To receive the promise that God has been giving them all these thousands of years. You're going to rule and reign. You're going to be priests, my priests. And Israel's going to be the chief nation of the world. A lot of people will hear this and go, you are on something, Jake. That's impossible. Well, I would agree with you if I didn't know who Jesus was. But every time Jesus says something, it comes true. So if If I'm a betting man, I'm going to bet on Jesus because he's never wrong. He's always right. Now look at verse 28 with me. He stops here, okay? There's pretty much been this has been chronological all the way through. By the way, all this stuff that we've seen that sounds dramatic and unreal, it's literal, okay? The moon being darkened, you're like, that can't happen. Did you know just what we know from science about every 500 years, this world goes through cycles? Every 500 years, like the overall light exposure on planet Earth gets darker. It's not a play on word. Well, maybe it is a play on words. The Dark Ages were literally dark, not just because it was a really miserable time to live, but it was literally dark. It was a third less light than what we have now. Now, how do they know that? I don't know. I'm just telling you what the scientists have discovered. And it happens on cycles. So when God says, or when Jesus says, so yes, when he says that in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light, that's not far-fetched to me. We already know that happens today in our world. How much more so when all heaven breaks loose? So, look at verse 28. Now, he does a parenthetical statement. He's given us a sequence of prophetic events, and then verse 28, he stops there and he describes something. He says, now learn the parable from the fig tree. When its branch has already become tender and puts forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Even so, you too, when you see these things happening, recognize, realize, know that he, everyone, who is the he in this passage?
God.
Who? Exactly. The Son of Man. That's the description Jesus gives. The Messiah, the Son of Man. That is, he is near at the door. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away. But of that day or hour, no one knows, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but the Father. Interesting. I thought Jesus was God. How come he doesn't know? I'll answer that in a second. The parable of the fig tree refers to Israel. If you guys go through the Old Testament, you get to study the Bible. Every time the fig tree is used as a metaphor, it's always representing Israel, the Jewish people, the nation of Israel. Throughout the Older Covenant, Israel's portrayed, there's a number of portrayals, okay, metaphors for Israel, but a fig tree is one of them. Jeremiah 24, 1 through 10, Israel's portrayed as a fig tree. Hosea 9:10, referred to as a fig tree. And Song of Solomon, chapter 2, verse 11, for behold, the winter is past. Interesting. I'm reading this for a reason, guys. What did he say? When you see the fig tree put forth its leaves, you know that summer is near. Song of Solomon, chapter 2:11. Behold, the winter is past, the rain is over and gone. The flowers have already appeared in the land. The time has arrived for pruning the vines, and the voice of the turtle dove has been heard in our land. The fig tree has ripened its figs, and the vines in blossom have given forth their fragrance. Arise, my darling, my beautiful one, and come along. I'm not going to I so badly want to dive into that, but I'm not for the sake of time. This fig tree, though, guys, in blossom foretells winter is past. I mean, it doesn't take a farmer to know that. You guys know when winter's past, right? You start to see blossoms. You don't know when winter... You're like, dude, it's really hard to tell when winter's past up here because it looks gray all the time, right? That's what you're thinking. Granted, but we know when we look at the trees, they start budding. Leaves start sprouting. I would say the grass gets greener, but not really. It's already green. It's so funny, when I moved here, side note, when I moved here, I think the first time I was here, the Northwest up here, it went like 52 days and it was a new record without rain. And everyone's like, we're in a drought. And I'm like, Bakersfield goes without rain like all year. Anyway, all that to say, guys, Jesus said this. He challenged some guys who were trying to challenge him. He said, you guys are teachers of the law. You say you know God's word. You know how to discern the signs of the seasons. You know how to say, like, if the sky is red in the morning, you know a bad storm's coming. And if the sky is red in the evening, it's going to be peaceful. Now, that didn't make sense to me until I moved to Georgia when I was in the Army. huh? And I remember one day coming out of my barracks and I looked up and I felt like, well, I'm going to date myself. None of you here have played the James Bond 007 game on N64, right? Oh, you're missing out. Anyway, there you could do different things with the game and change the lighting of the sky. And there's one of those settings where you can change a setting where it's like a red sky. It's really kind of eerie. Anyway, I remember looking up and I was like, oh, it's the James Bond game. It's real. What? Because these kind of things don't happen in Bakersfield. It's just always like glaring sun, like burning your skin off your flesh. So over in Georgia, though, the weather's different. I look up, I'm like, this is creepy. Like the sky has a literal red hue. Sure enough, not even an hour later, a massive deluge. A rainstorm that I have never seen in my life. I always wondered when I was in Georgia, I'm like, why do they have these giant, deep, like trenches on the side of the road? Again, we don't need those in Bakersfield. We just have curbs, pink, and a little gutter. Yep. So when it rains like an inch, we're like, it's the worldwide flood over there. It's nothing, right? Well, I saw why they have the giant trenches. It like in a blink of an eye, in a snap, all of a sudden it looked like we had these rivers running through the base. It was crazy. Through the fort, sorry. Armies do forts, not bases. Anyway, Jesus is giving us predictions of the seasons, the signs of the seasons of the prophetic times. He uses a fig tree, which is representative of Israel. For almost 2,000 years, guys, after AD 70, when Rome destroyed Jerusalem, Jewish people fled for their lives. And it initiated what you may have read in history called the diaspora, the dispersion of the Jewish people, where literally over the course of almost 2,000 years, they fled from persecution from one country to the next. You got Jews living in Spain, you got Jews living in Mexico, you got Jews living in China, I kid you not. You got Jews living everywhere. Papua New Guinea, they went everywhere. God said they would, and they did. All that to say, Israel's language and Hebrew roots were pretty much dead. They spoke Yiddish, they didn't speak Hebrew. Their cultural roots had shriveled up because they didn't have the temple for their life to revolve around now. So they had to, their identity as Jews changed. A dead language, a dead nation, but in one day in May 14, 1948, Israel put forth leaves signifying new life as the nation was voted in unanimously by the United Nations. It's probably been the only time the United Nations has done anything favorable for Israel. And they were born in a day. That same day, 6 nations descended on them and tried to wipe them out the very day they were born as a nation. And they beat them all. Interesting. Jesus says, when these things happen, know that the end is imminent. When what happens? When the fig tree, which we know represents Israel, puts forth leaves, new life. When that happens, what does he say? Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Verse 29, recognize that he, the Son of Man, is near at the door. Guys, we're in the summer season, and I would submit to you, we're at the end of summer. Summer is when you do harvest in Israel. That's one of the major harvest seasons. Kicks off in the spring, and it runs all the way through summer into early fall. Guys, Israel became a nation 74 years ago. What does he say? Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away. What generation? The generation that sees this happen. Now, the word generation can mean a number of things. It doesn't just mean generation like you and I think. It could also mean a race of people. Jesus makes 2 promises. One, Israel will never be wiped out. Despite what Iran would like to do with its nuclear developing arsenal, or any other nation in this world, or the whole world, should the whole world, when the whole world descends on Israel, Israel will not be wiped out. But on top of that, I believe, based on what Jesus says here, the generation that sees the fig bear leaves come to life will not pass away until all these things take place. What things? The tribulation, the Antichrist come on the scene, all of these things. That generation, that includes you and me, will not pass away until these things take place. So here's your second point. It's summertime and Jesus is close. Take these things into consideration. I know that it's probably hard. You're like, dude, Jake, I was just ready for school to be over. Now you're talking about the world being over. Yikes. Now here's a question though, because Jesus said it. Not even the Son will know the return. How could Jesus not know when he's coming back, especially if he's God? Philippians 2, 6-7 says that he emptied himself. When he came to earth, he emptied himself of his glory. He didn't even consider equality with God a thing to be taken hold of. That was on earth, though. I believe he knows full well when he's coming back. Now, you might be asking, as some people ask, what about the church and all of this? You keep talking about Israel. Where's the church? Is the church going to go through the tribulation? No. The rapture of the church will come before the Antichrist is revealed. Back in Daniel chapter 9, verse 27, it says that he's going to confirm a covenant with the many. The moment the Antichrist signs this peace or confirms this peace covenant, that's the initiation. The prophetic clock starts again. So right now, you and I are in overtime. You're talking like, where's the rapture? Oh, the rapture happens before what I just read. So when's it going to happen? It could happen right now. It could happen right now. It could happen before you get home tonight. That's how close we are. Everyone's like, that's ridiculous. Well, the flood happened, totally flooded the world. That seems ridiculous. God coming down and putting on a human suit sounds ridiculous, but Jesus did that. There's a lot of things that don't seem plausible to you and I, but remember, God works outside of our human confines and constraints. He's outside of space and time. We're the creation, not him. All this to say, guys, the rapture will come before the Antichrist. The church is going to be taken out. You know what's interesting? Now, let me just say this. For anyone who thinks that sounds ridiculous, it's not that ridiculous. I've said this not long ago, so some of you are like, oh yeah, I remember when Jake said this. You remember the Avengers Endgame movie?
Yep.
Thanos goes, skadoosh. Sorry, I just blended Kung Fu Panda with, anyway.
No worries.
Kung Fu Panda with Thanos glove. Oh, Salt Bay. Oh man, I'm just destroying all of your, okay, anyway. And in the movie, half of all life in the whole universe gone. I remember when that scene happened and I was like, they have no idea how creepy real that is. And you remember what happened after that? The whole world basically shut down. They were showing footage of like what Boston looked like. The world was just trying to pick up the pieces. Guys, that's going to happen. It's going to happen. Because Jesus said so. Now, I love first of all, you're not going to turn into ash. The rapture's not based on Avengers Marvel Comics, thankfully. Positive. This was written a long time before that. I know Stan Lee was old, but he's not that old. The church gets taken out afterward. Now you might say, how can you say that, Jake? Because again, God's word says in 1 Thessalonians 5:9, we are not destined for wrath, but for salvation. Wrath. That word is used intentionally. If you read Revelation chapter 6 and Revelation chapter 14, both times they describe, in Revelation 6, the wrath of the Lamb, and then in Revelation 14, the wrath of God. I heard Pastor Rick put it this way, or your dad. He put it this way. The first half of the tribulation, all hell breaks loose. The second half of the tribulation, all heaven breaks loose. See, we always think the devil's the one that's got all the power and the wrath. Nah. If you read the second half of the tribulation, there's a reason Jesus said, if God had not shortened the days, there would be no life left. God pours out his wrath when the abomination of desolation comes in. When he does that. But the church won't be there. At least I won't be there. I can't speak for all of you. I don't know where each of you are at. But guys, his return is imminent. And we know that because of what he says here and in a huge host of other scripture. So, how do we live today for tomorrow? You're like, thanks, Jake. Man, what a dump. Okay, hang on. Bear with me. This is where we're going to end tonight. Look at verse 33 with me. Jesus says, take heed. Remember verse 5? He says, don't be deceived. Don't be misled. In verse 23, he said, take heed. He says, take heed twice. In verse 23, behold, look, pay attention. I've told you everything in advance. Here he says again in verse 33, take heed. Keep on the alert, because you don't know when the appointed time will come. Like a man away on a journey, upon leaving his house and putting his slaves or his servants in charge, assigning to each one his task, also commanded the doorkeeper to stay on the alert. Therefore, be on the alert, for you do not know when the master of the house is coming, whether in the evening, at midnight, or when the rooster crows, or in the morning, in case he should come suddenly and find you asleep. What I say to you, I say to all. Here it is. He says with an